All right, well, welcome back to the next chapter as we move into the topic of personality and what's going on across the lifespan with personality traits. A lot of times when we think of our personalities, we think of our identity. And one important thing that I think I maybe brought up in a previous video was the issue of continuity theory. Theory says that we seek continuity in a lot of different domains of life across the lifespan. We want to feel like we're the same person across our whole entire life, have some consistent sense of identity and personhood, of course. But that doesn't necessarily mean that our personality traits are absolutely fixed. But it does, but we should maybe talk about something here a little bit. You might be familiar with the difference between what in psychology we refer to as traits versus states, right? And a state is something that's very transient. So that could be something like a mood, right? You're just in a good mood or bad mood, and that can blow over in a couple of hours. Traits are much more longer lasting. But again, the idea of a trait being long lasting doesn't mean absolutely fixed and permanent for the whole entire course of your life, right? That just that the rate of change will be a lot less dramatic and a whole lot slower, perhaps, right? So we'll consider this as something that can change. So we're going to start by talking about the key main theory of a personality that's popular in personality research, but also popular when we look at personality and aging. And this is known as the five-factor model, sometimes called the Big Five, but five-factor model is the official terminology here. And we can conveniently use the ocean technique here to remember our five traits. So O for openness, C for conscientiousness, E for extroversion, A for agreeableness, and N for neuroticism. So we have these five traits. The idea is that, kind of classic phrase from personality psych is people are individuals, so they're all different, but we're also similar to each other to the extent that, at least according to this theory, we all have these five traits. But what makes it different, or what makes us different from each other, is how much of each trait we have. So some people might score high, medium, or low in any one of these five traits, and the total number of different variations that you can have then becomes a quietly, that's not a word, right? Quite large and variable number of combinations. What's really also important here is that you want to understand traits as continuous, right? So you can have, like I said, high, medium, or low, or any number of values in between. Traits are not types, right? And so one thing we're not going to have much to say about in this chapter is type theory is an older way of approaching human personality, where people are sort of just kind of stuck into boxes and said, okay, you're this kind of person because you have this set of types of behavior, right? Um, and types are much more discrete, right? And discontinuous. Like I could just put you in this box and say, this is the kind of person you are. That doesn't really work with trait theory, where the traits vary in a more continuous fashion. You want to think of it more as a spectrum than a set of boxes, right? So, anyway, what we know is that these traits can, in fact, change over the lifespan. But what's important to first clarify here is this idea of rank order stability. So, what does that mean? So, what it means is that we can think of like a person who scores, let's think about the conscientiousness, right? The C. And the idea is that if you have a person who is really, really conscientious, that might mean that when we think about their rank order conscientiousness, what we're asking here is how conscientious is this person in relation to the average person or to most other people or something like that. And what we'll find is that we can calculate that, right? And then what happens is that as this person ages, their conscientiousness might change, and this is called a mean level change, meaning their their actual average conscientiousness score, as measured on some kind of scale that measures it, might go up or down, but where they remain in terms of in relation to other people stays the same, right? So that means other people change too, of course. And so everyone might kind of drift upward or drift downward on a given trait, and that shows a mean level change in that trait. But people's relationships relative to other people, that's their rank order, that remains a lot more stable as we get older. So It's important to clarify what we're talking about when we look at personality change over the lifespan. But now let's look at the five traits and talk about what actually happens with each one of them. We'll start with neuroticism. Maybe we're choosing that one because it maybe shows the greatest amount of change. It's hard to say exactly, but we'll start here. What we're going to see is that people's scores on neuroticism, mean level changes, start to drop pretty consistently throughout our entire adulthood years, not just in later life, but really consistently throughout our adulthood years. Neuroticism as a trait is a tendency towards strong emotional reactions, especially negative emotional reactions, where you let little things really upset you and you kind of fly off the handle a lot, and a lot of maybe emotional lability, right? A lot of dramatic mood swings. So as neuroticism declines, that means we're seeing less of that stuff, right? We're going to see people become more emotionally stable, less negative emotions, less reactivity. Make a note here as I have that you might want to think back to the socio-emotional selectivity theory. It's a tongue twister a little bit, because as we mentioned there before, when we talked about the social psych and some of the deception stuff, people tend to look for the positives in other and try to connect to things that are more emotionally meaningful, especially the positive emotions. So that would also be predictive here of a decline in neuroticism. Very much consistent then is an increase in agreeableness as well, right? Becoming more agreeable, more cooperative, more trusting. Again, we talked about that exact stuff in the social psych chapter. Openness here, that one doesn't change quite so much. We might observe some very small declines over the course of the adulthood years. Now, maybe in someone's much later years, so what we might see here is something of a nonlinearity, meaning that across the lifespan, we see fairly consistent, but very maybe slow, steady, linear declines. And then that might accelerate a little in our later years. But even still, it's not a huge change here. So this is not a trait that necessarily dramatically changes. But openness means open to new experiences and being a little bit more spontaneous as opposed to preferring routine and predictability. And so the idea that maybe that routine and less interested in novelty, that's something that can drop off just a bit, right? But not a lot, I want to emphasize again here. As I'm noting here, there's high variability in this kind of stuff because someone's tendency to show that kind of drop off can interact with whether they're male or female, what kind of their cultural background, and what role novelty plays in that cultural background, and even their level of education. All of that stuff tends to correlate a little bit. It's worth pointing out, by the way, that openness is also known to correlate with IQ, making it a controversial idea within personality theory in terms of whether or not it's really a personality trait and not some other variable that loads onto intelligence. But either way, that connection to IQ is kind of relevant in that regard. I mentioned conscientiousness here. So despite my example here, again, the changes are a little ambiguous. So what we find is that we're going to see some increases in conscientiousness throughout our younger years, throughout childhood and adolescence, and maybe even all the way through our younger adulthood to middle adulthood years. And this could reflect something that's somewhat interesting. So what we're seeing, and it makes a little bit of sense, right? It makes sense to think one of the things I'm doing in my younger adulthood years is I'm learning how to exist within the structured environments that I need to exist within, right? School is a type of structured environment. And in order for me to exist and to get by, I need to learn to do things like follow the rules and meet my deadlines and do all of those sorts of things, which of course means being conscientious. And then the same thing happens when I go out of school and I get a job and I've got, again, things that I've got to adapt to and rules to follow so that I can keep my job and make money and all of that sort of stuff. And of course, we might have families. And of course, that means we have to take on these other social roles like being a spouse and being a parent. And there's a certain amount of responsibility that comes with all of that stuff. So again, we need to be even more conscientious. So as we adapt to these various social roles, we become more and more conscientious because these roles demand conscientiousness. As we get a little bit older and we go through, these role transitions that we've previously talked about and role exits, maybe our conscientiousness declines a little bit, potentially because of some of these changes. Now, why did I mention that this is somewhat interesting besides what I just said here? We have a tendency to think of traits as reflecting something that comes from within us, right? that you're just inherently a conscientious person or you're not conscientious person because it's some sort of internal pre-existing disposition that you have as part of your identity. But what I just described is a pattern of personality that is really a function of your environment and how you adapt and fit into your environment and the change in your social role over the course of a lifespan. And that would suggest that personality is a bit more of a function of these kinds of external factors. And that's a kind of a controversial thing again in personality theory, where we tend to treat these traits as largely internal things happening inside of people. We're going to explore this once we get to the end of these notes and talk about these situational things a little bit more. Extroversion, again, we have nuance. So in this case, what happens is that when we think about um, extroversion in terms of sociability, right, is that's how much do we prefer um, social experiences and being around others and being having an active social life. Well, it declines a little bit. Um, and that's not really just a function of that narrowing of the social world stuff we've talked about previously, but it's just in general the idea is maybe a little less energy for social gatherings in some cases. But especially what we see is that when we kind of break extroversion down into some subtraits, one of them is called social dominance, and this refers to your sort of overall assertiveness and willing to kind of take charge in a social situation and be the life of the party and all that sort of stuff. And we see that that kind of stuff is the sort of thing that becomes a little bit more declines, right? And so the person who's a little more, we become maybe a little more reserved and retiring, and well, that's kind of the definition of low extroversion, which we sometimes call introversion, right? Related to that is also called, well, no, not related, sorry, separate subtrait, social vitality, right? Meaning that even though I have become a little more reserved and a little less so kind of, dominant in social situations, doesn't mean that I no longer enjoy the social situation. So that's what we're going to call social vitality, right? So just the overall positive affect that we show in a social situation and the enthusiasm for social situations, those can still be pretty consistent over the course of our lifespan here. And so again, the nuance here refers to the fact that we can break down extroversion into a couple of what we might think of as subtraits, and some might be stable and others may drop. Now, one thing we might ask here is, do we have to stick with the five-factor theory as our theory of personality? If you've had a personality course, you might know that there's other theories. Hexaco is a modern trait theory that has 6 traits here. And we might think, okay, is there a little bit more going on that we could maybe, is this a better theory? Well, 2 questions, right? Is that a better theory of personality? Does it better explain human variation? But maybe a better question for our purposes is, when we think about how people change over their lifespan, is it possible that the traits as they are depicted in Hexaco are going to do a better job of accounting for some of the age-related changes that we might observe? And of course, we could also mention some other personality theories like 16PF, the fact that there's 16 personality factors or traits. It's not super popular, so but again, we might say, does it shed a little more light into some aging because of the way it kind of splits out these traits into a little more depth and detail? And of course, there are the old type theories that I mentioned a minute ago, and one famous example is the Myers-Briggs, the MBTI, right, where you're given these 4-letter codes like INTP, INFJ, and so on and so forth. And so those are like the 16 types, right? And one question is, could those change over the lifespan? And it's a good chance they probably do, because one of the major limitations of the Myers-Briggs is that it is not particularly stable. People change their results on these tests, not even over the course of a lifespan, but sometimes over the course of, say, you take it today, then you wait 6 months and take it again, and it might come back a little differently. So retest reliability is a little low there. But what I will say, though, is that even though we could ask this question, that some of these other trait approaches might shed a little light on aging effects that we haven't otherwise seen, the answer is we don't really know too much, because when we look at the researchers who are heavily involved in personality and aging, they're really, really focused on that five-factor theory here that I wrote big five there, right? One little note there is that one of the dimensions of Hexaco is called the honesty humility dimension. And some of the aspects of personality that it captures here, I have listed right there: sincerity, fairness, modesty, resistance to greed and manipulation. If we think back to the social psychology stuff I've already referred to several times, we might expect that there's plenty of good reasons to think that these show some age-related changes that we would not otherwise think about and measure if we were limiting ourselves to the five-factor theory. But my little side note here is that there's a real lack of research on exactly that sort of stuff. And boy, it would be nice if someone did some research on this particular topic. So go out there and do it. Okay, off of my soapbox here. Costa and McRae are the ones who are really doing this five-factor stuff with aging here. And their approach tends to be the one heavily discussed in your textbook that they call it the maturational theory here, right? The idea is that what we're looking at here is something of a biological maturation process, right? That we're just seeing the unfolding of a type of a genetic plan, right? So even though our genes and our genome is fixed through epigenetic changes, right? Then the idea is that traits can change over time, but also not just epigenetics, but the idea is that maybe what happens is that part of the way in which the genes work is to determine how the brain ages over time, and that's going to cause certain kinds of, behavioral changes that will manifest as changes in personality. And this is really kind of a very dominant theme in personality and developmental psychology. Here is this kind of biological maturational approach to things. But I said earlier we would talk about these more environmentally focused perspectives, right? So we saw that idea with the social roles impacting conscientiousness. This falls under what's broadly referred to as a situationist view of personality. The idea here is that we usually define personality traits as the degree to which a person behaves in a very consistent and predictable way. And so the fact that a person who is conscientious is always acting in ways that we label conscientious is why we would say they're a conscientious person. But the situationist view says that what's happening here is that that consistency of that behavior, it's tempting to make, let's do some social psychology, internal attributions versus external attributions, right? So it's tempting for us to make an internal attribution about that person and say that the consistency of their conscientious behavior reflects the fact that they are just inherently a conscientious person, right? We're making a dispositional or internal attribution about them. It might be that as experimental personality psychologists, we are also making this kind of attribution that might not necessarily be warranted. Maybe we have fallen ourselves victim to the fundamental attribution error. So in that case, we might need to be thinking about someone's social environment and ask this question: is it possible that a person's consistency of behaviors, whether it's the conscientiousness or whether it's their sociability and social dominance as part of the extroversion trait or any of the other five traits of the total of those five traits, is it also perhaps equally explainable by the consistency of the situation that that person finds themselves in? So what am I talking about here? Well, again, social roles. So if you are a student, that means one situation that you find yourself in repeatedly is being at school, in a classroom, or around your teachers and so forth. So that means then that whatever behaviors are expected of a student occupying that social role then comes to become a consistent part of that of your behavior occupying that role. And do we want to say that that's just who you are and that's your trait, it's your disposition, or do we want to say that you are just being a member of a social role, you're occupying a social role, and that's how we're going to explain your behavior, right? This would then imply that as we go through the lifespan and we talk about all of those things, again, role transition and role exits, our behaviors might change because our roles and our situations change. So do we call that personality change or do we call it environmental change, right? Well, it's a hard question. And again, we just don't have solid answers to these things. But of course, it is worth pointing out, as we've talked about already, that We go through a lot of environmental reorganizations as we age, right? We might spend years in a career, but then we retire. Maybe we move. Maybe we go from our home to some retirement community or assisted living facility or other care facility. Um, our social environment changes because not just do our coworkers come and go, and if we retire and we're not around those coworkers, but our family, right? So the idea is that kids grow up, and so we exit the role of parent, and that, or at least parent of children, right? And then, of course, maybe they move away, so they're around less. So again, then the nature of these social situations is going to change. And this is all part of what we'll call environmental reorganization, right? The details of our social environment and our physical environment and our social roles will change pretty, over the various phases of our life. But there might be times where they stay pretty consistent, right? Like for all of the years you're in school or all the years that you work the same job and have the same kind of kind of role in that job. Now, once we start bringing in the role of environment here, we can look at the environmental factors that influence our personality and our identity and our sense of self, and our overall, existence as people here. So we'll call it the ecological model of aging here because we want to understand how the environment is playing its role. And one really good classic example of it is called the competence press model. So what's happening here? What are we talking about? There's two things. Competence and press are two different things. So competence is about what a person can do, right? So we know there's going to be changes in someone's physical health and their physical abilities, their mobility and physical strength, some of the sensory changes and motor changes and cognitive changes we've all talked about, even changes in some of your attitudinal stuff like locus of control, how much um, uh, how strong of a sense of being able to do things, right? Do you feel like you're an agent in the world and you can make things happen and that you have control over the events in your life? Or do you feel more passive in that you're kind of just always responding to the things that happen to you in the world? So these are all part of your competencies, right? And these, of course, change throughout the lifespan. And then also we have what's called environmental press, which is how much pressure does the environment put on you? What are the demands of your environment? So when we think about physical things, we'll talk about the affordances of the environment. Here we're talking about things like having a home or a workplace that has stairs. And so you can climb the stairs, and that's an affordance, right? You can judge that the fact that I have legs and I can climb stairs, and here's some stairs and I can climb them, and that's part of my ability and the environment. But of course, over time, what can happen is that our ability to safely and easily climb stairs might change a little bit. So the amount of environmental press that staircases place on us when we're younger is very low, but they press on us a little more as we get older, right? So we have these physical constraints. Then there's also the social constraints, right? The nature of those relationships and how much do my friends and other members of my community or my coworkers expect from me? How much involvement, how much activity, how much communication do they expect from me? And also the cognitive demands, right? Information can get more complex. We have, especially over the last couple of decades, as older adults have had to adapt to a lot of new technologies like cell phones and computers and the internet and all of these things that increases the amount of complexity of technology that we interact with. And that means that it gets more challenging, right? And also think about navigation demands, right? As cities get, as they grow and you have more roads and then you have to have more stoplights and more crosswalks and more cars on the road and navigating around town becomes more and more complex. Or if you are living in a city like New York City where you have subways and buses and taxis, and so you have to also maybe function within that kind of complex transportation system. Again, there's a lot of environmental press there. So let's think about what we're going to consider here is to be the match, right? What is the match between your competencies in all of these various domains versus the pressure coming from your environment here? And if, as long as they fit within some optimal range, then everything's going to be hunky-dory. But what we're concerned about here, so we'll call that your adaptation level. What is your adaptation level? And so what happens here is that the adaptation level could be such that the press is high compared to your competence, right? And what that means is that the environment is asking more from you than what you are able to do. And as you can imagine, it leads to these outcomes that I have listed here. People can feel overwhelmed. They're not going to function as well, and they're going to also experience a lot of negative emotional states as a result of this. The opposite can also occur, right? So the idea is that if the press is very low and your competence is high, you might feel bored and understimulated. And again, that might lead to some negative emotional reactions as well. So how can we have some insight into this? Well, a couple of things is that what happens as we get older and our competence may decrease in any one of these domains. Again, not necessarily all of them, right? As we've emphasized before, aging, it looks different for different people. We don't all experience the same declines in the same way and at the same time, but we may have various declines in certain competencies. And so now the idea is that as this happens, that means that prior to this occurring, that means that maybe our adaptation level was pretty good, and we are very competent, and the role of the environment is pretty minimal in influencing our overall daily life and well-being. But as our competence level begins to decline, the significance of environmental press becomes ever increasingly more important here, right? And so that's the idea of environmental docility uh, is that we become more kind of dependent on the structure of the environment here. Compare that to the environmental proactivity hypothesis, whereas as when we maintain high levels of competency, that means we have greater abilities to seek out those environments that suit our own purposes and suit our own needs, or if even not just seeking out, but even modifying and creating our environment so that it fits within our competencies here. So this gives us some insight into what exactly. Well, let's look at here, right? So aging in place, this is pretty important, right? Because what we want is we want people, when possible, to stay in their own home. That's what aging in place means. But of course, the ability to do this depends on this environmental press, right? What are the person's competencies and how is their home designed? Can they maintain an adaptation level within their own home? Why is it important, though? We might ask this question, right? What's so important about aging in place? Well, at face value, it might be somewhat obvious, right? This is a home that you have potentially lived in for decades and you raised your family there. And the last thing you want to do is have to leave it, right? And lose that and get rid of it. But we have some other ideas in psychology that might shed a little bit of light on this. And I don't think I want to try to go down this rabbit hole too far, but placemaking and self-making. What in the world is that? So the idea here is that when we exist in some kind of a place, we can think about what a place is by talking about those affordances again, right? And not something simple like the mere fact that there's some stairs and I can climb them as an affordance. But the idea is that in the world around me, there are many different things that I can do. And some of them are simple physical interactions with my environment, but other things might be more complex kinds of behaviors and interactions that I can engage in. And as I do this, as I start to interact with my environment, let's use an example of being a college student and you're on campus. And so that means that there are things like there are classes, and you can go engage with those classes and engage with your professors, and you can learn. That can be thought of in affordance related terms a little bit. Then there are also other students that you can socially interact with. There are student organizations and clubs that you can become involved with. And there are events that happen where you can go engage with all of that. There are so many things going on. And the more that you engage with each one of these different things, the more sort of engaged and present you become in your campus environment. And so what we're saying here is that the more you do this, the more this campus becomes a place for you, right? And contrast that with somebody who just kind of shows up, walks to class, takes their class, gets back in their car, and goes back home, and they never really engage with all of the other various things. From the perspective of a person like that, the campus is never a place for them, really, right? It's just something I go do and take a class and then come home, right? So their place is maybe somewhere else. But for someone who's really immersed in the whole rich campus life experience, then that campus becomes a place for them, right? So that's what we call placemaking. You have, by you yourself engaging in all of this stuff, you have made it a place for you, right? Not necessarily for everyone, but just for you. It is now a place to you, right? But what also is happening here is that because you are the one who's doing all of this stuff and all of these activities that you're doing are connecting you to this place, it's also becoming you that's doing this, right? So you're in fact defining yourself by your own choices here and your own actions. And so therefore the person that you become over the course of all of this activity is very much connected to the place that you're doing it in. So the claim here is that the act of placemaking, engaging the affordances of your environment, is highly coupled to the act of self-making, right? Becoming the person that you are. This then explains a lot of really basic, simple things too, right? Like why we become attached to places, why we might feel homesick if we have to leave home and we're gone for some period of time, because so much of myself is really cognitively and emotionally bound to that place. And if I'm away from that place, it feels like I'm just missing part of myself at that point, right? So put it in those terms. And now imagine thinking about an adult who has lived in their home and in their town for many decades, and they've engaged in all of these various affordances that are part of their home, right? The living and the family raising and all of that other stuff. And what happens if they have to lose all of that? They're not just losing the place anymore, right? We could talk about losing a really, really strong sense of self. And what does that do to their personality, right? If we think personality and self are so importantly tied to each other, it can be very damaging, right? So that's one good way to think about why aging in place is so critically important is what happens to the cognitive and emotional makeup of a person when they lose their place. And that's a big deal, right? So, but that doesn't mean that everyone can stay at home, of course. So that means that when we think about if we apply this ecological model to someone's home, right? It might mean that we need to make modifications to their home so that it matches competency. But should someone need to shift over to some assisted living or other similar kind of care setting, then that means that what we need to do is we need to design those places where the environmental press is calibrated. Keep in mind that I'm using this word calibrated here. It doesn't mean we just want to make it lower because, again, on the previous slide, we don't want press to be too low because that makes people bored. So we need to have an environment that does have some kind of structure and content and activity and some places some demand. One thing that's also relevant here is that if there's no demand, uh, you might become complacent, and then of course you're not really doing anything anymore. You're not trying anymore. You don't need to try, and that might accelerate more competency declines. So by always having to kind of push yourself a little bit, that can help preserve some of these competencies, some, right? So that's why we want to calibrate, right? We don't want to just across the board reduce, but we need to, that this means that we need to be very well aware of the patient competencies. PT is my abbreviation there for competence, patient, right? So that's the idea here. So this also gives us insight into some other things, right? So um, what's called excess disability, right? What we're referring to here is the idea that sometimes a person might have a certain amount of competency, but despite their competency, they're really not functioning well in their environment. We're trying to understand what's going on, right? Why does this person appear to struggle to be continue to live their life and maybe live in their home, even though when we bring them into a medical setting and measure their competencies, they seem to score pretty well on a lot of various tests. Well, again, we could say that maybe the explanation is we're just paying too much attention to these internal things, and we need to focus on their environment, right? They just don't have a good calibration or fit to their environment, and it's causing excess disability, right? That is, even though the person is not disabled, the high press of their environment is causing them to behave as if they're showing some disability when they don't really have it. This also gives us some insight, by the way, into understanding how assistive technology works, right? It's not just about helping people do things, but it's about an assistance that is tailored to whatever the press happens to be for this person, right? So we're boosting competencies as needed based on the environmental press. And so it's a useful way of kind of rethinking the entire logic behind assistive design and assistive technology. All right, so that's wrapping that up, right? So we're good to go on this chapter. If you have questions, let me know.